Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, so quiet. I think it's the end of a Tuesday, I suppose. Thank you for joining us. For those who don't know me, my name's Daniel Haran. Oh, and those are some bells. Okay, great. And I'm professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. And I am so happy to see real life faces. We are joined virtually and are streaming by a lot of people, in fact, but we are glad to see people returning in person in these hopefully end of pandemic days. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first in a series of lectures this fall focused on the theme developing a spirituality of resilience. First, just a few words about the Center for Spirituality. Founded in 1984 with the generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Center for Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, we draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and Christian heritage more broadly, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our exciting event this afternoon, we also wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land and to honor the Native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. It's with deep gratitude that we recognize these Native peoples and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. So the format for our program today includes Dr. Wicks's lecture, followed by time for some questions and comments from both our in-person and live streaming audiences. I'll also mention that we have some handouts at the entrance or now exit of our auditorium, a sheet that includes a suggested bibliography of texts by Dr. Wicks, for more information related to the theme of today's lecture, as well as little brochures about forthcoming events here at the Center for Spirituality this semester. It's now my privilege to introduce our guest today. For over 35 years, Dr. Robert Wicks has been called upon to speak calm into chaos by individuals and groups experiencing great stress, anxiety, and confusion. Dr. Wicks received his doctorate in psychology from Hahnemann Medical College and Hospital and is professor emeritus at Loyola University, Maryland. He has taught in universities and professional schools of psychology, medicine, nursing, theology, education, and social work. In the past, he has spoken on his major areas of expertise: resilience, self-care, and the prevention of secondary stress, that is, the pressures encountered in reaching out to others. He's done so on Capitol Hill to members of Congress and their chiefs of staff. He has led a course in resilience in Beirut for relief workers brought there from Aleppo, Syria. He has spoken at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, the U.S. Air Force Academy, the Mayo Clinic, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the Defense Intelligence Agency, as well as Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Divinity School, Yale School of Nursing, Princeton Theological Seminary, and to members of the NATO Intelligence Fusion Center in England. He has also addressed the FBI, the New York Police Academy, and caregivers in more than 20 countries around the world, but he's here with us today. Add that to the list. In 1994, he was responsible for the psychological debriefing of non-governmental agency relief workers evacuated from Rwanda during the genocide. In 1993 and again in 2001, he worked in Cambodia with professionals from the English-speaking community who were present to help the Khmer people rebuild their nation following years of terror and torture. In 2006, he also delivered presentations on self-care at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda and Walter Reed Army Hospital to those healthcare professionals responsible for Iraq and Afghan war veterans. And more recently, he addressed the U.S. Army healthcare professionals returning from Africa where they were assisting during the recent Ebola crisis. You can see why we're so thrilled to welcome Dr. Wicks here today. He has published over 60 books for both professionals and the general public, including the best-selling book, Riding the Dragon, which is available in the lobby for sale by our bookstore, as well as another book of Dr. Wicks called Night Call. He'll be available afterwards, by the way, for conversation and be very happy to sign books for those who are interested. His latest book from Oxford University Press for the general public is titled The Simple Care of a Hopeful Heart, Mentoring Yourself in Difficult Times. As I mentioned, after this event, the college bookstore has copies of some of Dr. Wicks's many books, and they're available for purchase, where Dr. Wicks will also be very happy to sign them. His lists of awards and recognitions is too long to read in its entirety. Otherwise, we would have no more time to hear the wisdom that's about to come to us. But I should mention that it includes a number of honorary doctorates, including from Georgian Court University, Caldwell University, and Marywood University. And he is the recipient of the Vatican's Papal Medal for service to the church and beyond. So please join me in extending a warm St. Mary's College welcome to Professor Robert Wicks.
Thank you, Father Dan, for that introduction. It was long, wasn't it? I always get nervous when the introduction is too long that they'll end with, and then he died. It's a pleasure for me to be here at St. Mary's College Center for Spirituality. I'm grateful to Father Dan for asking me to speak on remaining resilient while living a rich, compassionate life in today's time, which are very, very difficult. And I'm going to quickly go through a lot of material. The reason I say quickly is when Father Dan invited me, I said, do you want me to be informational? Do you want me to be inspirational? Do you want me to be humorous? He said, no, I want you to end on time is what I want. So I'll try to do that. A number of years back, not too many, 2 or 3, I received an invitation from Ethel Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy's wife, to attend the 50th memorial of his death. And, so much was going on and I didn't know whether, I could do it. And I shared that with my oldest granddaughter. And she said, this is a no-brainer, Pop, go. And when I went, there were a lot of speakers that were noted, like Bill Clinton and others, and they were good. But what I took the most from that was Robert F. Kennedy's words that would be interspersed. And one of the phrases that I remembered is, we can do better. We can do better. You see, when you live a compassionate life, it really is a gift to others. As the Chinese proverb goes, when the tide in the harbor rises, so do all the boats in the harbor as well. As a matter of fact, if you are Christian, isn't compassion the actual heart of your faith? Because you're called to act, not just speak, as Jesus did. In this regard, the challenging question Father Godfrey Diekman once posed is, what difference does it make if the bread and wine turn into the body and blood of Christ if we don't? If we don't. Compassion and caregiving also benefits you. As physician Albert Schweitzer once said, I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I do know, the only ones among you who will be really happy are those who have sought and found how to serve. But while all of this is true, that doesn't mean that it's easy. What you and I need to recognize is what I share with physicians and nurses, psychologists, counselors, social workers, as well as those in ministry and other aspects of caregiving. And namely, just because you're willing to carry the burden of compassion doesn't mean that it's not heavy. As the Japanese proverb goes, eventually even a gushing spring can dry up. As was mentioned in the introduction, several years ago, I was in Beirut to work with caregivers living and working in Aleppo, Syria, and they brought them to Beirut so I could speak to them through an Arabic interpreter. And one of the Marist brothers there, shared what he was asked by a young volunteer in Aleppo. She said to him, "Why am I losing the best years of my life? Why am I not like the rest of the girls in the world? Why do I not have the right to live fully my youth? Is this God's will? Why does he not answer our prayers and our pleas? In spite of our trust in him, we do not see the end of the tunnel." The brother then added, "What answer can I give her and so many other young persons? I listen to them, I support them, I try to stutter words of trust and faith, and this isn't always easy. And so I bring you both good news and potentially bad news. The good news is you wish to be compassionate because compassion is at the heart of a rich life. The bad news is you wish to be compassionate. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung put it this way: the brighter the light, the deeper the darkness. Because you're so committed and talented, there's a tendency to deny, intellectualize, or seek to avoid or minimize the impact of ongoing stress and turmoil present in the church, society, our families today. Plus, if you're someone with a history of compassion or involved in a healing or helping profession, people often simply expect you to ignore or not be affected by the stress you face. But that kind of attitude does not work. So let's face it, everyone copes. You cope, I cope. This presentation and my books is meant to share some ideas about doing it a bit better because, quite simply, you deserve to live a better life as somebody concerned for others. The problem is often no one sees the sacrifices compassionate individuals and professional helpers and healers make. I remember walking down the street and seeing a friend of mine who's a spiritual director. And I said, "How are you doing?" And normally people just say, "Fine," even if their leg's falling off. Instead, she stopped and filled up. And I said, what's the matter? She said, "No one has asked me that question in a long, long time. I ask others, no one asks me." So what are the keys of, if any, of not merely surviving, but actually potentially benefiting from the extremely challenging times we're in? Well, I think we need to look at psychology and spirituality. I believe psychology is a gift from God. It's like a shovel to be used to plant the tree. Some don't understand that, and they stand idly with the shovel in their hand, praying to God to plant the tree. You have the shovel, for heaven's sakes, use the shovel and plant the tree. It's like Carl Rahner's comment about, theological anthropology. He said, you've got to recognize that unconsciously you're moving toward God or away from God. You need to unpack that, and psychology helps. Others think that psychology is equal to spirituality and faith, and that's arrogant. It's merely a tool given to us, which we will use in this presentation as a help. And so in this talk, I want to reframe what I feel is important for you to reflect upon with yourself and your fellow students or colleagues. And secondly, highlight the challenges that can't be ignored. You have to face them. What I will share won't be terribly new. I don't do new, okay? So get that out of your heads. But what I want to do is psychologically and spiritually dust off key concepts that you need to refocus on. And in doing this, I'm going to ask you to do something radical. I'm going to ask you to listen as if you haven't heard this information before. And I want you to have a sense of openness with a virtue at the core of it. It may be the most important virtue. You might say, well, what is the virtue? Well, let me give you an illustration, because even if you want it, doesn't mean you're going to have it. A number of years ago, my daughter, who's a social worker, was sitting at dinner with her husband and the two granddaughters. And she loves to do these games with them, and they love it. They get right into it. So she said, "Before you leave the table, I want to know from the two of you, what gifts has God given you that you're going to share with the world and you need to focus on?" And they got into it, and they're sharing their gifts. And finally, when they calmed down, my son-in-law, who hadn't said anything, said, "Well, what about humility?" And the youngest one was about, I guess, 6 at the time, said, well, what exactly is it? And he said, well, get the dictionary. And he read the definition of humility. And he said, now, who do you think of when I read that definition? And both my granddaughters and daughter chime up, mom, referring to my wife. And he said, well, what about Pop-Pop? And they go, no, not Pop-Pop. So even if you want this virtue, there's no guarantee you'll get it, but it is important to keep it center. Why? Because when you take knowledge and you add humility, you get wisdom. And when you add that very wisdom to compassion, you get love. And love is at the heart of living a compassionate life. It's at the heart of all of life. God is love. And once again, I want to remind you that the themes I'm about to discuss are not just about you. They're told you to aid you in the basics of resilient self-care and maintaining a healthy perspective so you can take better care of others. Because one of the greatest gifts you can share with others is a sense of your own peace and resilience, but you can't share what you don't have. So let's recognize we are right now in the midst of a spiritual and psychological winter solstice. We've been in the dark, we remain in the dark, but yet we can see points of light. In addition to a pandemic, we're confronting worldwide pressures, divisiveness, and violence in society, countries, communities, and even in the church today. But as sacred scriptures teach us, this is not by any means new. In Mark 1:40, Jesus was approached by a leper who knelt before him and said, if you wish to do so, you can make me clean. In response, as you know, Jesus, moved with pity, stretched out his hand, touched him, and said to him, I will do it, be made clean. And the leprosy left him. Please note that he touched him while he still had the leprosy, not after he was made clean. And when we are close to people who are suffering, we run the risk of not only catching their physical diseases, but also to be contaminated by their spiritual and psychological ones as well. So given this, given this frequent lack of support for persons caring like you, who reach out to so many, I think we need to emphasize enhancing personal resilience, improving self-care, and deepening your inner life through alone time, where you spend time in silence, solitude, and gratitude to God as a way of processing your compassionate or professional caregiving encounters. In enhancing personal resilience, I'd also like you to become aware of what we call in my profession, post-traumatic growth. It is the psychological parallel of the spirituality of suffering. And when it occurs when we don't simply bounce back from stress, but paradoxically, because of it, become deeper as persons, both psychologically and spiritually, in ways that would not have been possible had the trauma or stress not occurred in the first place. We have to have a sense of honesty about the stress. Don't spiritually romanticize it. But then a sense of openness to where it can take you. Let me give you an illustration from my own life. My daughter, when she was very young, was diagnosed with severe scoliosis. And we brought her to this hospital that dealt with it. And they said, well, we'll put her in an orthoplastic jacket. I said, well, what's the duration? Well, it'll be 23 hours a day. I said, but how long? 3 years. And then we'll see what happens. Well, we were very faithful. And toward the end of that 3 years, he said, it's not working. We need to rush her in, fuse 13 levels of her spine. And if you're in the medical profession, you know, bone takes forever to fuse, and stick an iron bar up her back. Well, I said, Jesus, sounds pretty severe. He said, well, he said, it's going to be fine. But I said, you got your doctorate in psychology from Hahnemann Medical College, didn't you? Yeah. He said, well, I need to cover myself legally. So if I miss and I chip her, she may be paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of her life. So we bring her in for the operation. She has it, and she's just a little pumpkin. And she comes home, and people ask the natural question, oh, is she better? They mean well. But life is not acute, it is chronic. Because later on, when she was in university, she crawled into the house in pain. We had to send her to Hopkins to have the rod taken out. Then when she gave birth to her second child, she almost died. But she had a decision, like we all do. Do I become bitter? Do I constantly ask things from people? Or do I let it soften my soul so that I can experience life in ways that some others can't because they haven't gone through what I have? Well, I knew she chose the second route. When she was in university and she said to me over breakfast, there was just two of us. She said, there's something, Dad, I want to tell you that you don't know. And I thought, oh, glory be to God. I said, what? And she said, I always wanted to be a Marine Corps officer like you were. I said, really? You did? She said, yeah, but I can't now. I said, well, what are you going to do about it? She said, I'm going to become a social worker and work in the VA with those coming back who are in need. And she did do that, and now is responsible for severely injured returning Iraqi and Afghani vets. And one day a new vet walked in, and he had no leg on the left side. And she greeted him warmly, like only she could, because she's gone through so much. And he said, boy, you're perky. And she looked him right in the eye and she said, you've served our country well. Now you come on in. Let us know what we can do for you. With post-traumatic growth, we have an opportunity to mature psychologically and spiritually in new ways and understand our signature strengths more clearly, particularly what I would call the shadow or minor ones. And as a result of post-traumatic growth, we can become more appreciative for life and the persons in it. But we can't play down the stress. You know, not being aware of serious stress in our lives as you reach out to others, which is the call of persons like you and me, otherwise you wouldn't be here, can be quite dangerous in the acute form, especially when you've been dealing with those who are traumatized. I was giving a talk at the National Naval Medical, no, it was in Germany. I was working with chaplains who had just returned from a war zone. And before I could even speak on my book, Bounce, Living the Resilient Life, this full bird colonel walked up to me and he said, before you give the talk, Dr. Wicks, I want to caution you. I said, what's the caution? He said, there are a lot of ghosts in this room. I said, what do you mean? He said, there's nothing left inside them. However, surprisingly, maybe for you, it's been for me, is chronic secondary stress, what we call burnout, can be even more dangerous at times. We need to recognize that the seeds of compassion and the seeds of burnout or chronic secondary stress are the same seeds. Physicians and nurses who took epidemiology courses years ago probably remember being taught that for every case of poisoning, there's at least a dozen cases of subclinical toxicity. Well, what does that have to do with what we're talking about today? The same is the case with secondary stress, the pressures experienced in reaching out to others. All in the helping and healing arena, including you, especially you, should be concerned, not just extreme cases of severely impaired souls, you know? And it's my belief that we all have to recognize the dangers we're in. And part of the reason for this is we must encounter change. Openness to change helps us to unlearn, as the disciples needed to do on the road to Emmaus. We can't avoid change if we wish our faith to be a dynamic force and our lives to be current. Author Kathleen Norris addressed the dynamics of change in this way. She said, disconnecting from change does not recapture the past. it loses the future. But again, it's not easy. The problem is that most often experiencing the stress of necessary change is a developmental process, not a cataclysmic event. It can just slip up on us. Author and media theorist Marshall McLuhan once said, if the temperature of the bath rises 1 degree every 10 minutes, then how will the bather know when to scream? We don't know when to scream today. You know, it's very easy for you to lose your way, even when you're seeking to be a dedicated and committed individual to what is good. I try to share that virtually with the 800 nuns I spoke with recently. It's dangerous. You know, you think, well, I've got a great mission. When I was in South Africa, I gave a talk and I was trying to help them after apartheid ended. And this woman come up to me and she said, you know, I know what you're saying, but I just can't do it anymore. I said, well, what is it that you do? She said, I'm a social worker who works with women who've been sexually and physically abused to get them justice. And to do that, we have to go to court. And she said, that means they got to take a day off from work, and they're poor and often single parents. And yet they do it because they want the justice. And then we go into the court, and we hand the papers to the judge, who's often male, and he looks at him and says, oh, I haven't had time to read it yet. Make another appointment. She said, I'm a total failure. Well, I let the dust settle because she was pretty upset. And then I said to her, well, who was with that woman other than you at that moment? She said, no one. I said, would it be an exaggeration to say that you were closer to her at that moment than anyone else in the world? She said, no, it wouldn't. And then in as gentle a voice as I could muster, I said, and you want to leave that? I said, don't you realize we are not in the success business? We're in the faithfulness business. In a similar vein, sometimes intense interactions, you know, with people who come to you or people in your family or circle of friends, you may not appreciate, the natural consequence and eventuality of failure. See? When I worked with surgical residents, I'd say, before we get into this whole resilience bit, I want to be clear with you that during your tenure as a surgeon, you are going to kill people. Maybe not through malpractice, but through mispractice, because it is literally impossible to be at an A level 100% of the time. You know, this group in this room and virtually tuning in, I would say that you probably fail more than the people around you. You might say, well, why? Because it's a statistical fact. The more you're involved, the more you're going to fail. So you better get used to failure and put it in perspective. A contemporary of Jesus, Rabbi Tarfon, once said, the day is short, the work is great, the laborers are sluggish, the wages are high, and the master of the house is insistent. It is not your duty to finish the work, but you're not free to neglect it, unquote. Alan Bisak of South Africa echoed this theme in saying, we will all go before God to be judged, and God will ask us, where are your wounds? And we will say, if we're honest, we have no wounds, Lord. And then God will ask us, was there nothing worth fighting for? Well, you might say, if you've been involved in caregiving, well, I don't have to worry about that. I got plenty wounds to show the Lord. But are those wounds that you and I show the Lord, are they real wounds? Or are they wounds as a result of our big egos and our lack of faith? You know, we all have to face failure. See, no matter how nice we are and how good we are. And I remember being once asked to speak to a group with terrible morale. I got in the room and you could cut the hate with a knife. And I'm not famous. They didn't even know who I was, but they hated me. And I thought, well, let me give it my best shot rather than the slow build. And I gave it my best shot. Nothing. I was clinically impressed. I've never seen people be able to keep hate at such a high pitch for so long. So I had a break and I went back to the room they had given me. And being religious and having a big ego, I prayed those prayers like, relieve me of this. I even moved into some Old Testament laments like, smite them and their little children. And I sensed Jesus saying, I know where you got that, but we don't do that anymore. But at that moment, a piece of scripture bubbled to the surface that I heard many times, but I never got it. And what bubbled to the surface was, they did terrible things to me and the prophets before me. They will do the same to you and worse at times. It was like I was hearing Jesus say, Bob, normally you say religious things and people smile and they embrace you. But when things get difficult, you want to run away. In such instances, we have to be able to lean back psychologically amidst our stress so we can be mindful, prayerful, rather than simply reacting to those we live with, your family, friends, coworkers, parishioners, volunteers, or those you serve or guide in some way. Because without being reflective or prayerful, we can lose our way very, very quickly. When I was speaking at Walter Reed Army Hospital, at the break, a real sort of rugged kind of physician, Army physician, came up to me. I could see he was going to drop it on me, And he come up, he said, you got a moment? I said, I do. He said, I'm blowing my whole life through my ass. Can you help me? I said, can you be a little more specific? And he said that he had just got back from Iraq and experienced quite a bit over there. And then all he was doing at Walter Reed was cutting people's legs off. He said, I'd like to take a damn gallbladder out for a change. And then he said he'd go home and he'd go upstairs and he'd try to hit a few golf balls to calm down. And his wife would burst in the room and say, what are you doing? You're at work all day and then some, and then you're hitting golf balls instead of being with me and the boys. This marriage is going down the tubes. And she slammed the door. I said, well, what do you do after you work? He said, well, I go home. Now he's angry at me. This frequently happens. And I said, well, you can't do that. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, let's put it this way. When you go to a restaurant and go to the bathroom, what's the sign say over the sink? If you work here, then you need to wash your hands before you go back to work. You and I who work in the hospital, we know we need, when we go to the bathroom, not simply to wash our hands after we go to the bathroom, but before. So we don't contaminate ourselves with what we've experienced on the floor and then in turn contaminate others. I said, you're leaving here spiritually and psychologically contaminated. He said, well, what do I do? Is it a big deal? It's very simple. After work, instead of rushing home, just walk around the hospital a bit. If that's no good, because they'll yell, doc, doc, then get down to your car and sit there and relax for a while. Let the dust settle. Let the dust settle. And first look at the geography, the psychological geography, the objective geography of the day. What happened? And then psychologically look at the subjective geography. Not only what happened, but what did I feel? What did my cognitions, ways of thinking, perceiving, and understanding the situations lead to those feelings? So you can then look at your beliefs, your schemata underneath, because often the things we think and perceive are totally crazy, but we don't realize it because we haven't examined it. And then I said, go home and apologize to your wife and say, you deserve me to be mindful, be in the present, with my eyes wide open to your life and the boy's life. And I am, then tell her you are going to go upstairs and hit the golf ball for a few moments just to calm down and clean your psychological palate further. And then take off that uniform, take off that role. And that's why I always encourage people when they go home, change your clothes. But I don't need it. Just change. You're in a different role, it will help you feel yourself being in a different place. You see, this physician needed to psychologically and spiritually lean back. And yet you, as you know, even if you're religious, that even if we're aware of the importance of reflection, prayer, and periods of mindfulness meditation, there's no guarantee you're going to do it. Don't lie to yourself. How do you value quiet time now in silent solitude and wrapped in gratitude? Give me a break. Don't lie. I'll give you an example. I was in Cambodia giving a talk to the members of the international community that were there to help the Khmer people rebuild Cambodia after years of terror and torture. And at the break, a Buddhist nun came up to me and said, "Do you have a moment, doctor?" I said, "Sister, I do. What can I do for you?" She said, "We have a young Buddhist who is the chaplain in the hospital at the unit that deals with farmers who have lost their legs to landmines so they can put prosthetic devices and help them resume normal activities. And he's getting very depressed. What do I do?" I said, "Well, sister, tell me this. When he's finished with work in the hospital and he comes down and sits in the car and meditates before he goes back to the temple, what comes up in his meditation? Then I can give you a better response." And she looks at me like a deer caught in the headlight and she's, "Oh, I am so embarrassed." I said, "Sister, what would you be embarrassed about?" She said, "I'm a Buddhist nun." And I never thought to ask him about meditation. You see, we need to have periods of reflectiveness during the day, whether you're going to the bathroom, a nutrition break, taking a walk at lunch, whatever, so you can increase the gap between the stimuli you're receiving and the responses you make to that stimuli. Such a process of reflection is also clearly a first step in increasing your emotional intelligence, where you look at your dysfunctional thinking, see how it might impact your emotions and actions, and reflect on how you can control and handle, and express your emotions in your interactions. I think without them, without periods of reflection or lectio divina, we can forget the importance of dealing with unprocessed pain. I remember coming home from work one day, and my wife said, "Well, how was your day? How are you doing?" I said, "Awful." And I still remember sitting down in the chair in the kitchen. I didn't even take my raincoat off. She said, "Did something happen today?" I said, No. I just feel awful." And then I thought about it, like I encouraged the people who come to see me, the helpers and healers. And I realized I had absorbed people's anger, their stubbornness, their sense of helplessness and hopelessness. It was starting to just eat away at me. So what do you do in those instances? Well, you need to put things in perspective. And when I think of that, I don't think of a shrink to help me keep that perspective. I think of Thomas Merton, the Trappist. He was once passing a day room, and in the day room was another monk, 50 years a monk, but looking down. And Merton went in and saw him and said, "Brother, are you okay?" And he said, "Father Lewis, I'm not okay. I'm losing my joy, my peace, maybe my faith." I wouldn't have known what to say to him. He's 50 years in religious life. You know what Merton did? He smiled at the old gent. He put his hand on his shoulder and he looked him in the eyes and he said, "Brother, courage comes and goes. Hold on for the next supply." This is often what we must do, but we have to do it by being reflective during the day so we can see what triggers emotional pain and causes moral injury in our education and work settings. In reflective periods, we can also discover what and who provides us with psychological safety and a healthy community. The bottom line is reflective periods are not simply nice, they're essential. They help us gain, regain, and maintain a healthy perspective. And psychiatry and psychology know this, but actually it was religion that started all that business. In the Talmud, it's written, "You do not see things as they are, you see things as you are." In the Christian New Testament, in Matthew 6:22, "If your eye is good, your whole body will be good." Buddhists speak about it as the unobstructed vision. Hindus in the Upanishads as a turning around in one's seat of consciousness. One spiritual master with the need to have a healthy perspective in mind, said to a disciple who was forever complaining about others, he said, seek not to change others, but seek to change yourself instead. And then he gave him an image. He said, remember, it is easier to protect your feet by putting on slippers rather than trying to carpet the whole of the earth. But what do you and I do? We leave the house and we enter the carpeting business because we have two psychotic ideas. The first crazy idea is that people will appreciate what we do for them. If that's not nuts enough, the second is they'll actually follow what we suggest. Instead, we need to give with a sense of mitzvah. What do I mean by that? Giving and expecting nothing in return. And to do this, it's really a true outgrowth of 1 Corinthians 12, where you seek to find your charism, your gift. You know, that's what education is about, finding that gift, not just simply providing answers that satisfy a professor. Finding that gift and then feeding it and sharing it. There's a Sanskrit word for faith, it's viswas. And literally translated, it means to breathe easily, to have trust, to be free from fear. And what that is it's our inner spirit. Sometimes we feel it's only what we do that's important. But, that's not the case. It's not simply the lyrics of what we do, it's the music that can make a difference in people's lives. That music is our sense of presence. So where do we begin? I think 4 questions. 1, what aspects of your work, personal life, and relationships are most challenging and stressful to you? It's going to be different for each of us, okay? Depending on our personality or history. Second, what habits or routines should you keep and which ones do you need to replace? Given the changes you must deal with at work, education, and personal life. Third, what approaches to dealing with increased pressures have you found most helpful? There's a lot of wisdom, in those of you listening to me, so you should share that wisdom with each other. And finally, how can you improve the ways in which you approach your personal and professional life? To answer these questions, I think it's very important to pay attention to the words of a guru, guide, or mentor that you value. And since we're here at this center, I'd like to choose Jesus as a model and give you the scripture that I based this presentation on. It's Matthew 22, 34 to 40, where Jesus is asked a classic rabbinical question. What is the greatest commandment? And he, being a good rabbi, does 2 things. First, he puts people at ease, and when they're at ease, he pulls the rug out from under them. And secondly, he reaches into Torah for his answer. He reaches into Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And first thing he does is he reaches in and takes one of the heavy precepts of the 613 precepts of the Pharisees of the day, and he holds it up high and says, you must love God with your whole heart and your whole mind and your whole soul. And you could see them nod. How are they going to disagree with that? But then he grabs a light precept and holds it up on the same level as the heavy precept, and he says, and you must love your neighbor as yourself. And in doing this, he gives us the 3 elements of the spiritual life that need to be held in balance. Presence to others, because I don't think it's possible to experience true joy without sharing ourselves while expecting nothing in return. It can be a circle of grace. Second is presence to self, through self-care, self-knowledge, and self-love, because you can't share what you don't have. And finally, presence to God, because God is our center and guiding light. Or if you're atheistic, a presence to a sense of oneness with the world. So let's look at these 3 briefly, and then I'll wrap it up, and then we'll see if we have any questions or comments. First, presence to others. I just want to say just a few words. Don't underestimate the simplicity of being present to people in pain. A little girl came home from school one day and she was late and her mother was nuts. Where were you? I was worried. Oh, she said, I was helping a friend who was in trouble. She said, really? What'd you do for her? She said, I sat down next to her and helped her cry. Simplicity. Second is respect. Respect. I had a patient once who was sexually abused as a child, and I was seeing her as an adult, and I was coming to the end of the treatment, and I wanted to make an intervention. I wanted to say something to her, but I didn't want to be a hypocrite, because when I supervise psychiatrists, psychologists, other helpers, when they say something to a patient, I ask them, why did you say that? Why did you say that now? Why did you say that now in that way? And what did you expect? Don't tell me it was intuition. You can't behaviorally, calibrate for intuition. Good intuition comes out of good discipline as a helper. So I thought, what do I want to accomplish? I want to interrupt this woman, let her take credit for all the hard work she's done in therapy, and then ask her how she got to this place. So when she enters darkness again, she'll know what to do, because darkness comes and goes for us all. So I said, just a minute. I said, picture my face as a mirror. What do you see? She said, I see a woman alive with the spirit, a woman who's resurrected that little girl that was lost because of the abuse. And she's integrated her with the woman she is now. And because of it, she's hot stuff. I said, yes, you are hot stuff. But how did you get to this place? You weren't this way when you first came to see me. She said, you mean you don't know? I said, not really. I'd never ask you a question that I fully knew the answer to. She said, oh, it's simple. I said, simple? She said, yeah. The first time I came in here to see you, I simply watched how you sat with me, and then I began sitting with myself in the same way. Respect. I think when we model respect, it's amazing. Maya Angelou put it this way: they may forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. This comment reminded me of a different story of how horribly the inmates at a certain concentration camp were treated. However, when they returned after a day of dehumanization and impossible work, a stray dog that had gotten into the camp became so excited to see them that he wagged his tail vigorously, so that he, the dog, rather than the quote unquote human beings running the camp, reflected for the prisoners that they were worth a great deal as persons. But how do we prepare to be such a presence to others and be more at home with ourselves? I think 3 simple but profound steps. The first is know the dangers of being a compassionate person. And I'll mention just 1 or 2. Second, take care of yourself and know yourself more fully at each stage of your life. And have your own constantly revitalized practice of mindfulness and alone time. First, the danger. You have to be careful of being overly involved. Being overly empathic is dangerous. I'm not asking you to be callous, but I just don't want you to get overwhelmed by the emotions, needs, and unrealistic expectations you love and care for. You see, the opposite of detachment is not compassion. It is seduction. We're seduced by the expectations and the emotions rather than simply saying, what can I do? And then do it and let others and God take care of the residue. You see, there's an Eastern European proverb: when you sleep next to the cemetery, you can't cry for everyone who dies. Detachment is part of a triad. We lean back when we're feeling emotions. We reappraise what we're thinking and believing. And then we become renewed by this accuracy so we can re-enter. Another danger is anger, hurt, and fragility among those in your family, your friends, co-workers. You're going to be approached by people that often they're not grateful to you for what you give them, and they're not going to respond positively. You have to be aware of that. I remember once being asked to mentor a colleague, and boy, was she bitter. Wow. And she'd see me week after week, bitter week, and finally she surprised me one day. She said, oh, I read your book, Riding the Dragon, and I really loved it. And I was surprised. I said, well, thank you. And in the next breath, she said, too bad you're not like what you've written. Well, after I prayed for her early, happy death, I said, well, of course I'm not like what I've written. People preach and write out of their shadows. They put where they need to go as well. But obviously from the tone in your voice, I've let you down. Let's talk about it. And the final one I want to give you is a failure. This is going to be strange, but the danger is a failure to be grateful for all that's in our lives. But what you don't realize is a failure to be grateful is natural if you're involved in life deeply, because we're primarily focused on what needs to be done as well as problems and challenges. But life is more than that. Vietnamese Zen Rashi Thich Nhat Hanh once reflected, during the war, we were so busy helping the wounded that we sometimes forgot to smell the flowers. He said, night has a very pleasant smell here, especially in the country, but we would forget to pay attention to the smell of mint, coriander, thyme, and sage. I went to Hanoi about 5 years ago to work with the international community doing helping, and I was going up a river and I remembered his words and I could smell those scents. And it helped me balance out my experience there rather than just focusing on what needed to be done and all the hurt around me. So what do we need to stay afloat? I think we need self-care and prayer, or at least mindfulness. Because the good news is that it's not the amount of darkness in the world, the church, our family, country, or even in ourselves that matters. In the end, it's how we stand in that darkness. A perspective that will allow us to integrate autonomy, our will, with theonomy, God's will, so we can experience freedom and a way to view things that is so healthy. But this requires that we be present to ourselves. I think you and I are probably the worst because we're concerned about people with self-care. We're terrible at it. I think the humorist Irma Bombeck had it right when she says, I think that any man that watches 3 football games in a row should be declared legally dead. The reality is that we metaphorically eat whatever comes along psychologically and spiritually, rather than saying, well, I need to build these things in. If you feel guilty about it, then recognize that when you build them in, it strengthens you so you can continue to be compassionate. So you need what you need is a self-care protocol, a self-care program. And in the library here, they probably have a copy of Bounce or my book, Overcoming Secondary Stress in Medical and Nursing Practice. You just Xerox the part that says the self-care protocol. You don't even have to read the whole book. And take a look at it and reflect on it. And the 2 key things I think you're going to see in it is friendship and prayer. Friendship is important. There's a Cameroonian proverb that goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Now, I'm realistic about friendship. When I came back from working in India, I brought a saying that goes, when once you've been bitten by a snake, you become cautious even of a rope. Your friends have hurt you at times in your family, but I'm aware of another saying that goes, a friend knows the song in your heart and can sing it back to you when you've forgotten how it goes. I think we need 4 types of friends. First, the prophet that says what voices are guiding us. The second is the cheerleader who's sympathetic to us. And, we call him at the end of the day, you're not going to believe what he said and did. And she said, I don't believe it. You're totally right. He's totally wrong, And, and you, because you're humble, you say, well, I might have had some minuscule part to play in it. And she said, no, you're a saint. I'm praying that locusts invade his house at this very moment, So if you just have prophets, you'll burn out. If you just have cheerleaders, you won't grow, but they balance each other. Just like in therapy, when you work with people, if you're just, clear, you cause narcissistic injury. If you're just gentle, they don't grow, but it's that balance. And the third friend is the harasser or teaser, because on the way to taking God seriously, your life seriously, it's very easy to do a detour to take yourself too seriously. And finally, it's the inspirational friend that calls you to be all that you can be without embarrassing you that you are where you are. One word on alone time and then the wrap up. I really feel that time alone allows us to have perspective. When I was up on Capitol Hill, one of the senators was asked, what is the greatest challenge of facing the American Congress today? And he surprised people. He said, not enough time to think. I really feel that we need this alone time. But you know, Anne Lamott, who's really funny and insightful, said almost anything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. But then she reflected further and said, my mind is like a bad neighborhood. I don't like to go there alone. The reality is that we often go down 3 dark alleys when we are in quiet time. One is arrogance, where we project the blame on others. Well, giving away the blame is fun, but then we give away the power to change. The second is ignorance, where we condemn ourselves. That's a waste of energy. God doesn't condemn you, so are you bigger than God? And then discouragement, because you want immediate results, when in fact, you know, rather than being tied in chronos, it's a sense of kairos. We need to recognize time is larger than we make it. Well, let me wrap it up now. A few brief comments. First, at about the 10th session of psychotherapy and mentoring with persons like yourself, all the dirt is on the table, the angers, the fears, the sense of being misunderstood. And as I look into the sad eyes of the person sitting with me, I feel it. And I think, you know, if only you could see how good you are. If only you could see what a positive difference you've made in so many people's lives. And I hope that they do get that perspective in the therapy or mentoring, and I wish you the same. If you haven't been in darkness recently and you're not in darkness now, you will be, because when you're deeply involved in life, you will have dark periods. And you may, you know, use psychology, and you should. It's a great gift. It's a good shovel. But the darkness may not lift as fast as you'd like. And then you may get on your knees and pray, but still the darkness may not lift as fast as you'd like. But I promise you no less darkness and no quicker lifting. But I promise you this, that if you remain present to others in a caring way, remain present to yourself, maybe in a deeper way with greater self-knowledge and self-love and self-care and presence to God or something greater than yourself, you will become different. You might say, well, why? Well, because when you're in darkness like that and you're fully present, you experience humility. And as I said before, when you take knowledge and you add humility, you know, you get wisdom. And when you add that wisdom to compassion, you get love. And so we need to do whatever we can to have the stamina that comes from having a healthy perspective, because the world needs our healing presence, our resilience. Let me close with a story. On March 23rd, 2017, President Bill Clinton traveled to Derry, Northern Ireland, to deliver the eulogy for Martin McGuinness at St. Columba's Church. And during his presentation, he shared a phone conversation he had with Nelson Mandela after he had become president of South Africa. Mandela had called and said he was getting so much criticism, and Clinton asked him if it were from the Afrikaners. And Mandela told him, no, it's from my own people. They think I've sold them out. And Clinton said, well, what do you say to them? And Mandela said, I say yes, and I spent 27 years in jail. They took the best years of my life away. I didn't see my children grow up. It ruined my marriage, and a lot of my friends were killed. And if I can get over it, you can too. We've got to build a future. I think we all do. And I think being part of that building is the great joy of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wicks. We have some time now for questions and comments from our audiences, those gathered here in person and those joining us virtually. If you have questions online or comments, please put them in the Q&A or chat, and we will read them out loud here for everybody to hear. And Dr. Feder will have one microphone on this side, and I will move to this side so that we can hear each other. Just raise your hand.
Oh, it's like the 5th grade. Everybody's looking down. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Wicks, so much for this rich talk. Because I know that many of us here are students in a class that I'm teaching, actually, where we're talking a little bit about gender and religion, I couldn't help but think, as you were sharing these great insights about how different groups of people face different challenges and pressures when it comes to stress and when it comes with coping with stress. And this is something I know during the pandemic that got some news coverage about how women were feeling kind of burnout and social demands differently than men, who of course have their own kind of social pressures. Do you have any insights for us about how social pressures like gender and kind of other factors shape how people experience stress and can engage these coping strategies?
Yeah, that's a complex question, but you saw it in terms of just simply the working at home. You know, the women were working at home professionally and were also often the ones responsible for the children. And the males just worked at home. I mean, now that's not in all cases, but the ability to handle many things is a great gift. The ability to be present in so many healing ways is a great gift, but it's also a great cross. And women would express to me that guilt. I said, well, let me see if I have this right. You're doing most of the work and you feel guilty. I said, you got to have one or the other. You can do most of the work or you can feel guilty, but you can't do both. And they'd laugh and say, well, yeah, isn't that crazy? But he's not up to it. The other thing is that you would see in the experiences greater compassion in women at that time because they could see the hurt, they were worried about it, and also they were faced with complex issues. For example, when things get out of hand, very little children need to be reassured. Once you move beyond latency, questions have to be heard. If you reassure the adolescent, they're just going to blow you off. If you start offering all kinds of opportunities to the younger person, then they get anxious. And they also pick up more than what's happening in the world. They pick up what's happening in you as a parent. That's the first presence. It's that connection there. So it was very interesting for me to see the different things. Also the style, where you'd see male anger often. You'd see more alcohol and drug abuse. And the instance of wife abuse, spousal abuse went way up during the initial phases of the crisis. So it was an acting out. I deal with my anxiety by drugging or acting out. I deal with my stress by taking care. Now, those again are very simplified breakdown, but there's enough evidence to say that it happened enough. So that's the.
It looks like we have a comment or question from online. I'll hand this over to Rebecca.
We have a few questions from the online chat. Could you please repeat the 4 questions?
Oh, okay. What aspects of your own work, personal life, and relationships are most challenging and stressful to you? It is different for every person. Secondly, what habits and routines should you keep and which need to be replaced given the changes you must deal with both at work and in your personal life? Third, what approaches to dealing with increased pressures have you found most helpful? We often, focus on the stresses and what we need, but there's a lot of wisdom in this room. And you try to share that and receive it from others. And finally, you even see sororities get together and they talk about this stuff, and it's really important because you're sharing wisdom. And finally, how can you improve the ways in which you approach your personal and professional lives? I think it's in this darkness that we have the opportunity to see what is really of value in life.
Another question from the online chat. How can we be compassionate in light of the difficulties in the US, such as the January 6th insurrection?
Yeah, that question is an excellent one. And I want to go to a really, an expert a little bit. He's one notch above Freud, Mr. Rogers. And he said that when he was under stress, his mother would say, focus on the helpers and the healers. Look at those people that are doing good. The thing is, newspapers sell, and your news media features the negative, and I think that they do it because it sells. That's what they do. But the reality is that so much good is going on in the world that we don't hear about. So that I do several things. One is I try to catch that 90-second thing in the morning on the news. So I'm not in the hiding from the news, but then I don't let it constantly beat me up as they go over it and over it. I got the picture, but I keep a close eye out for what good is happening locally, nationally, and globally. And I do it because I think it really encourages my soul and says, keep going, you're not alone.
Another question. You made a distinction between real pain and pain as a result of our lack of humility and big egos, and graciously offered yourself in the position of the latter. Yeah. Having been in that position, how do you suggest enhancing humility and shrugging off some of the more superficial pains?
I think by laughing at yourself, we take ourselves too seriously. The reality is people don't get up in the morning thinking of us. And we walk around acting like that. And we become so concerned about how people view us and, whether we're having an impact. How many hits do we get on the internet? Or, how many people respond to this? Or what do people say about us? And so the reality is, though, that with a personality style, you're always going to have a growing edge attached to that style. And the style can be good. Like my style to be passionate is good. But if I'm anxious and I'm passionate, maybe I'm trying to be the center of attention. So my ego is forcing me to take up too much space. I remember a patient came in to me one day and I said, well, what can I do for you? She said, I just need to recognize that I'm too out there. I'm too aggressive. I said, well, can you give me an illustration? She said, well, recently I found out that my boyfriend was going out behind my back. Now I could tell she was emotional, so I was going to fan the emotion. I don't use the same size doesn't fit all, right? If a physician gave everybody who came in the office a splenectomy, you'd obviously have uneven surgical results. So you want to pick the personality style. So I said, wait a minute, let me see if I have this right. Your boyfriend was going out behind your back? She said, yeah, could you believe it? I said, well, with who? With whom? She said, my best friend. I said, spare me. Did you call him? She said, yes, I did. And what did you say to him? And she told me, and I said, oh, I've never heard the words put together quite that way. Very colorful, very colorful. And I said, and did you hang up on him? She said, yes, I did. And didn't that feel great? She said, yes, it did. And I said, you want to give that up? She said, but I can't keep doing this. I'll lose my friends. Well, maybe, she said, I need to throw it away. I said, wait, stop. Aren't you passionate? She said, well, yes. I said, we have enough of dull people in the world. Aren't you ethical? Would you have done this? No. Aren't you somebody that pretty transparent? What you see is what you get? Yes. I think what you're asking me to do is you've got all these gifts. You want me to help you find those situations when your very gifts become growing edges or defenses. And that's the same thing with humility and the ego. This humility thing is something that you work on forever. And for somebody with a big ego like me, because of insecurities, then that helps, because you can then walk with people, you know, who others might not be able to walk with, because you've carried a similar cross. So that would be the best shot in terms of an answer. Okay.
Let me just take a moment to again thank Dr. Wicks for such an extraordinary presentation. Let me also thank Dr. Julia Fetter, who is working with the Center for Spirituality this year as a project coordinator, Miss Rebecca Holm, who is our student worker and who is skillfully running our virtual side of things. And to all of those who've been joining us in the live stream, thank you. Just two announcements. One is to continue to look at the Center for Spirituality events page for forthcoming events. The next in our Developing a Spirituality of Resilience series will be on October 13th at 5 o'clock. It's entirely virtual. We will not be gathering in person, but we'll be joined by Dr. Christina Pekalski of George Washington University, a physician who is going to offer some wonderful insight from her own context and experience there. And I also want to, again, remind you that in our lobby, Dr. Wicks will be present to chat and take personal questions and comments, as well as to sign books that are for sale by our bookstore here. The bookstore folks wanted me to convey that they were expecting more copies of some of Dr. Wicks's other books that didn't make it here. We'll call that supply chain issues still. But they said if you're interested, they'll take your name and the bookstore can provide those copies when they do arrive. So please visit with our good friends from St. Mary's College Bookstore out in the lobby. And thank you all again for joining us. Have a great evening.